Thank you. Good morning. My name is Marie Vendettouli, and I am a senior statistical programmer at Hutch in the Statistical Center for HIV/AIDS Research and Prevention here in Seattle. Today I'm going to talk to you about the new R package, valtools, and how we here at Sharp have used this for performance qualification testing. This is an example of the software validation separate from development paradigm, which is one of several modes that the package implements. Before I get started, let me extend a huge thank you to the R Pharma organizers for inviting me, and to all the volunteers, presenters, workshop instructors, and attendees for making this event so successful. Also, many thanks for the efforts of the development teams here at Sharp and Fuse for authoring the theoretical framework and for package implementation. Everything I'm sharing today has been a huge team effort to get to this point, and we have big dreams for taking it further. This work was supported by a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Vaccine Immunology Statistical Center for Collaboration for AIDS Vaccine Discovery. Okay, so valtools is an R package that configures and extends the developer features available from other R packages for the sole purpose of facilitating software validation. The first question we have to ask is, what is validation? And more specifically, what is software validation? One perspective to take is that it is an activity of truth-seeking, where we intend to prove that software implementation is true or correct. Another perspective to take is that software validation is merely an act of making something legally recognized. I say merely because while the former suggests a risk-based approach, the latter suggests an activity that does not add quality to the software. And when we dig into the categories of question from that truth-seeking perspective, we see some themes emerge. The first is one of suitability. Whether the software is fit for purpose speaks to the suitability of an algorithm from a scientific perspective. And whether the software integrates well with an org's existing practice addresses the suitability of the technology for human interaction. Second is one of trust and communication. Many times with third-party authored software, as users, we simply do not have enough influence on the developers to specify what edge cases have been considered. If a particular software has only seen limited uses, there might be questions also of implementation quality or a lack of information regarding the breadth of appropriate use cases. Finally, there is the effort involved in tackling software validation. When we plan software validation as an afterthought, we may be under some time constraints that prevent being intentional about the infrastructure that facilitates this process. The R package validation framework and valtools is intended as a considered and consistent approach for validation, which focuses user attention on the decision-making steps and not the overhead of confirming by observation. So we can label these themes as fitness for purpose, reproducibility, and effort. None of these are especially groundbreaking ideas, and I suspect that many of us successfully balance these challenges as we go about our daily coding practice. Now, let us consider software validation from the regulatory perspective. I'm referring to the FDA guidance here, General Principles of Software Validation, Final Guidance for Industry and FDA Staff. And as we read that blurb, we see that validation is confirmation that the software conform to intended uses, that the requirements can be consistently fulfilled. So what are the themes in this section? We're verifying fitness for purpose. We are checking for reproducibility across use cases. And we anticipate making the effort to confirm by observation. So in the previous slides, I made the case that software validation, either of the truth-seeking variety or of the regulatory flavor, shares some common features, one that we here in the R community have robust solutions for. Now I'm going to address a nuance of the difference between that truth-seeking behavior versus simply ticking off boxes for the sake of licensure. This example is a case study from USDA Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, Center for Veterinary Biologics. As context, this is the regulatory agency that is charged with upholding the Virus Serum Toxin Act of 1913, which is the set of regulations that keep our animal vaccines safe and effective here in the US. So on the screen right now is a picture of my girls, Patience and Kaylee. In addition to being named after characters from my favorite TV show, they have both been vaccinated against rabies. And as a regulatory requirement, each lot of that vaccine was verified for relative potency by the manufacturer against reference data. So this means that a 4PL curve was fit to the full dose curve for both the test lot and the reference, and the log of the horizontal shift was estimated using curve fit parameters. By definition, this horizontal shift is only meaningful because both lots were manufactured using the same methods, or at least close enough that there is no vertical shift between the curves. In the right-hand graph, the x-axis is a serial dilution, which may be expressed as a concentration or dilution, and the y-axis is the ELISA optical density. One interpretation of this parameterization is that the parameters A and D correspond to the lower and upper asymptote, respectively. X is the value in dilution units, and C is the location parameter, and B is the scale factor. Of note is that in this scenario, the sign of the scale factor corresponds to the direction of the pseudolinear region. We also expect that the theoretical value of the lower asymptote is 0 because we expect that the response is non-existent with increasing dilution. This is a simplification of 4PL down to the 3PL modeling. But this is not the whole story. Depending on whether the assay is immunometric or competitive, whether we choose to use dilution units or concentration, a visual inspection of the horizontal shift will indicate if the test lot is of greater potency when the shift is to the right, in some cases, and to the left in others. In the set of graphs on this slide, we see that using the parameterization described previously, greater potency is always to the right when using dilution units, and changing from dilution units to concentration units corresponds to a change in the sign of the B parameter. But not all software uses this parameterization. In one commercial software, the constraint imposed is that the sign of B is always positive, regardless of whether the response is immunometric or competitive, and whether the units of X are dilution or concentration. Mathematically, you can still solve the equation, and this resolves so that the definition of the asymptote parameters are fluid with respect to how they're mapped to upper versus lower asymptote. While both of these approaches to parameterization are true and well documented in the source literature, the takeaway for purposes of software validation is that in some cases, the value add of ticking the regulatory boxes is by driving consensus regarding methodology. So a few more words about software validation. Not all validation code is software validation. For example, we might validate code used in data processing. If there is no system in place to use the same code repeatedly, and copying and saving the code into a new project really doesn't count, this is out of scope for this talk. Additionally, traditional forms of development testing, for example, unit, regression, or integration testing, are not part of software validation in valtools. Now, an org might choose to allow certain tests to reduce or eliminate the risk or the need for software validation, but this is a risk assessment that each org must make and document according to their own procedures. Finally, the decision-making component of software validation. What requirements need testing? What tests cover that requirement? These are activities that are internal to the org in the project at hand. So to recap, software validation is an activity that is organized into a process. We define requirements and test cases. We execute the specified tests and document resultant observations. Repeat as necessary. Requirements and tests define software suitability. We anticipate reproducibility when executing the tests and expend effort to document observation. What we now need is a way to organize these elements for easy navigation and accessibility. So our package validation framework is a community project that includes team members from across Pharma. For the last year, this group has been working towards a white paper that describes a theory of how to consistently validate our software packages, which has been recently accepted and should be online soon. This theoretical framework identifies the elements of validation: the requirements, the optional test cases, test code, and reports. It specifies a common organization of validation elements that can exist either within an R package or separate from any package. Additionally, the paper proposes a process for evaluating test code in order to generate reports, a system for sharing validated code and reports that is accessible both during development and after a package is installed. This process is consistent for developers who add validation as part of preparing their R package, as well as users who need to validate packages or sets of packages that are authored by others. So what are the validation elements and where do they live? The expectation is that when adding validation as a developer, the components of requirements, test cases, and test codes are initially created in the validation subfolder of the vignettes folder. Requirements capture goals of the project. Test cases are a description in words of how the software meets requirements. Test code are test cases implemented as R script. And the validation report RMD file identifies the order of all the information needed for final reporting. Specific to validation as part of our package development is the question of revalidation. Of course, developers will want to execute their validation report prior to distributing the package, if only to ensure that validation testing was correctly authored. However, this is little use to the user, who is unlikely to be using a shared system with that developer. Will they be installing from binaries and tarballs, or will they have access to the package source? This distinction affects whether the user has access to the report, RMD, and any supporting files in the vignettes. So after installation of a package, a user might want to revalidate the package after some system change has occurred. For example, if a dependency has been updated or some system configuration has changed. Reinstalling to validate is not always a paradigm, especially if the computing environment is controlled by others. So within the report itself, we also want to consider various reporting elements. So for example, the most recent authorship, edit dates, tables of mapping between requirements and test cases, or even summary tables describing the validation testing environment. And the technical implementation for handling this is captured within valtools. So valtools right now is available only on GitHub. I do believe there are plans for future submission to CRAN. And then there's also a workshop tomorrow. I believe it's filled, but the material should be made available shortly. The functions within the valtools package broadly fall into three categories. First is a set of quick start functions. So these will initiate the validation framework. This will allow you to create individual elements from templates. It's not required to use these helper functions, but it certainly makes the whole process a lot faster. A second set of functions help with management of report content. So these would be tables and any sort of summary of the validation environment. And then finally, the final group are workhorse functions that really handle the validation through multiple modes. So we have kind of three sets of users. One is the first group is if we're doing things separate from development where we don't have access to the source code of the R packages. Perhaps we're looking at multiple R packages. Perhaps we're validating a package that was generated by the community or even just a different group within our own org. The second set of validation modes are for developers. So whether you're running validation while you have access to the source code, whether you want to run validation as part of installing to your system, or whether you want to run validation at distribution. And then the final mode is for after installation. So once a package that has these validation elements have been installed to your local system, how do you revalidate? So again, if you've updated a different dependency, or maybe there's some option that you changed on your system. So when we talk about these quick start helper functions, the real benefit is that we get these templates, and it kind of helps you get a little bit further on the path without knowing necessarily all the names of the tags. But then when we move into this validation sphere, we have all of these different modes of validation. And the difference is not simply that we're starting like separate from package, or if we're starting from source code, or we've already installed the package. It's also where we look for the validation report output. So in a separate from package, it's all going to be in the same folder, that validation folder. But if we're validating from source code, what happens is that the package is installed to a temporary workspace that doesn't affect your current working environment. And then the report is executed and just the PDF is copied over into the inst folder. When you validate installation, of course, you're installing the package while you execute that PDF. And then when you're validating as part of a build, it just gets popped again into that inst folder location so that it is part of the tarball that you can distribute. Validating after installation just allows you to specify a designated location, so it doesn't change your work environment at all. So valtools, even though we are strictly on GitHub for now, it is a fairly robust package. We've used it in Sharp for development of internal R packages. We have a nice README, there's a vignette walkthrough, some cheat sheets, and a very active issue tracker. So feel free to find us online. Try using the package. I think there was a recent release pushed out in the last day or so, and let us know what you think. So next I'm going to talk about how we've used valtools for performance qualification testing. So one difference of performance qualification testing from package development is that we're looking at how the whole system performs, not just the individual component of a particular package. And so it makes sense to use that validate separate from development paradigm because we don't want to save anything to a specific package. And in fact, in this case, we're not actually validating anything we've authored. We're just validating our own system to make sure that base R works as expected. So routinely, PQ testing can be done at periodic intervals. It could be done, at startup if you want to be especially cautious, or it can be a risk-based approach where you're only doing that validation after a system change. So again, validating separate from package was the paradigm that we chose. And the reason why we chose this was because it's within the R environment. It is re-executable and extensible. So as we want to add requirements or add test cases, we don't have to start from scratch. And honestly, it was very similar to the previous validation work that we had done internally. So it's really fast for us to hit the ground running. One thing you'll notice as you look at the process of validating separate from a package is that we have all these helper functions first to initiate the validation framework, add validation elements, etc. But they all start with VT _. So it's a quick way to find functions within the package. And then the helper functions to add specific file types starts with VT use. So you can just type in VT use and then pick from the options in the dropdown if you're using your RStudio to find a function. So some of the questions that came up while doing PQ testing, what tests do we want to run that will capture the default state of the working environment? When do we expect differences to occur between systems? Like when I test my local machine versus testing on a server, what workflows are we actually using? Do we have to test exhaustively or can we take a risk-based approach to reduce the number of test cases? Those kind of questions are really both org and project dependent. They made sense for us. Your org might have other requirements as part of performance qualification. The two questions I think are generalizable, though, are how can we communicate expectations between stakeholder groups, and how do we keep track of validation code over time as it evolves, as we add future test cases. So the first part, how do we communicate expectations between stakeholder groups? We have the option of creating multiple reports using the same input element. So on the screen I show like a requirement report, which just has the one requirement here, but then the validation report not only has the requirement, but it also has the test case in readable form, and then the results of executing that test code. And so the nice thing about this is that I can structure reports for the audience that I intend. Like I don't have to send a full validation report to somebody who's just reviewing what requirements are necessary for this project. And the real benefit to whoever is in charge of executing the validation is that we get to keep it dry. We do not repeat ourselves, and we use the same files for populating both the requirement report and a validation report. It both comes from this requirement markdown document within that validation folder. And so this is really helpful not only when you're communicating subsets of information to various stakeholders, but as you move forward in testing. So for the next round of testing, I get to use all of the requirements that I had previously. And the next question I have is, how does my validation code evolve over time, right? So because we've broken out all of the requirements, all of the test cases and all of the test code into separate files, it makes it very easy to track via Git. So we can link a particular validation instance with either a particular release or a particular version or even a particular commit within that Git repo. So some decisions that valtools cannot help with. So these were those first questions. I think these are the questions that a lot of us ask when we start validation. What are we trying to validate? Where do we expect to see changes? And the nice thing about breaking out requirements from the rest of the report content is that you can start writing the requirement report, send it out to your stakeholders. You can have a chat about it, multiple meetings, however that decision is driven. And then simultaneously move on to authoring your test cases and your test code for the requirements that have been accepted. And it really parallelizes the process. So what we liked about using valtools at Sharp is that first we have this modular development, which really allows us to take advantage of versioning tools like Git, and also lets us reuse our code going forward. There's a lot of flexibility as needs change. I can easily drop a requirement. I can add additional ones, depending on what the discussion leads to. There's parallelization between the decision makers and the testing phases. And then there's accessible materials for both developers and non-developers, because whoever is reviewing those requirements is not necessarily somebody who is interested or willing to go to a Git repo and dig through that validation folder. The bonus for us also was that we had a single paradigm for our system validation and package development. Okay, and that's what I have for today. I think we're a little over time, I'm sorry. But if you have any questions, please post them in chat or reach out to me elsewhere. Thank you.